hello to everybody. It's great to see participants from so many parts of the world. I think everyone was sharing that it's lovely weather today. It is in London as well. And I'm just going to take you through a project that happened in parallel to the recent update to the Common European Framework of Reference, with particular focus on young learners. This is going to be quite a theoretical session rather than a practical one, because the idea is to give you a solid background in where we stand for the description of language and communicative competence for young learners in the Common European Framework of Reference, the CEFR. And I'd say we're at a sort of halfway point with that, that this project is a first step in the right direction, where the Council of Europe have collated existing work on describing competences in language portfolios, which I'll explain in a moment. So I'll talk about the rationale of the project, how the project was conducted, so you can see from that what the relevance of the content of the project is to your context, and also the open questions it raises for next steps, both for researchers and teaching practitioners. Okay, so we're talking about illustrative descriptors, and if you attended any of the previous webinars with Brian North or Enrica Picardo, you'll have some background in what we mean by that, but the main point is that the Common European Framework of Reference is not just a scale of levels that we attach onto things, but that they are very clearly described by can-do statements, what people can do at each level of the language, and we call these illustrative descriptors. So between 2014 and 2017, there was a project to extend the range of descriptors available in the CEFR. But this is at a global level, it's not age specific, and in parallel to look at what work has been done for young learners. So we set out to collect together a representative sample of validated young learner portfolio descriptors. So the European Language Portfolio is a project in parallel to the Common European Framework of Reference. It's also a project of the Council of Europe and the ECML. And this is still available online as a website, giving you templates to create portfolios for learners to do reflective and formative self-assessment with teacher guidance. And so we've collected can-do descriptors written for these portfolios in multiple contexts across the European member states of the Council of Europe, to see to what extent they correspond now to the main descriptor scales of the CEFR. So there was a matching exercise as part of this project, looking at those descriptors developed by young learner teaching practitioners and relating them back to the main illustrative scales of the CEFR. But because the CEFR has been extended, broadened, with new areas such as mediation and online interaction, it's obvious that existing language portfolios for young learners won't contain learning aims for these areas. So another aspect, the third point on this slide, was that we wanted to evaluate and filter all of the descriptors, including the new ones, and with expert consultants decide which ones might be relevant to convert into young learner descriptors for portfolios in the future, from the new areas as well. So this highlights something that is really important to understand about the CEFR. I think a lot of misunderstanding centers around the idea that it is a complete curriculum, that it must be followed, that it is prescriptive, and that the scales have to be used in their entirety. But people who've worked with the CEFR understand that In fact, it's a reference work. It's an inventory that you can select from according to context. And the original text has chapters with scales of descriptors in them, 3, 4, and 5, and they describe language activities and the competences that you use to mobilize those activities and so on. And those are validated by teaching practitioners across Europe in large-scale questionnaires and feedback. So when it comes to using them in your classroom, even for adult programs, it's important to be selective and also maybe to adapt them into learning aims. And users are actually invited to do this, so that in fact that there is a final step that we need to do in the local context. And Brian North calls this unzipping the descriptors. Some descriptors are quite long in the CFR, and you might need to make them more concise. But also with young learners, obviously there's a simplification and a contextualization that needs to happen if they're going to be accessible for the learners themselves to refer to in language portfolios or such like. And so that's our work on the local level with the CFR. And also the CFR is not language specific. So all of these statements are for what the outcome of communication is. There is still a recognition that depending on the language you're teaching, I think in most of the contexts we're talking about today, it's for English, but it could be for any language, and you still need to provide the language support, the grammar, the vocabulary, and the CFR acknowledges this, but it doesn't provide that part. This is provided by the local language provider. So that's just to really summarize what the CFR is and what it isn't, and the implications for local elaboration. And so also the European Language Portfolio, ELP, has 3 sections. Many of you may have worked with something like this. There is a front part which is called the Language Passport, where learners can actually rate their levels of competence across different languages, their plurilingual proficiency. You might rate yourself B1 in Spanish, A2 in Italian, B2 in English, and then your first language might be C1 or C2. The language biography is the part that we're interested in for collating these descriptors, because that's where you have goal setting and self-assessment with can-do statements. And in a young learner portfolio, obviously this is made accessible with pictures, thought bubbles, simplified statements, but they help learners reflect on what they've done and their achievement beyond just grades in tests. It's more meaningful in that sense, and it's related to the level they're studying the course. And then finally you have the dossier, which is the illustration of achievement and experiences. They might put bits of best work in there. But the bits that we collated were the can-do statements from the language biography. And the assumption was that we would need to relate these to the main CFR scales, but that they wouldn't be relevant to all of the descriptors in the CFR. This is taking into account that there are individual differences in learners, but also cognitive development to take into account, because the CFR descriptors are not age-specific, but they take in all adult domains as well. So if we look at this diagram visualizing in a very simplified way both development of communicative linguistic competences on the vertical scale, and then literacy and socio-cognitive development, there might be gains made in terms of language and communicative competence, but then a deepening has to happen in terms of socio-cognitive development to tackle those tasks in more adult ways. And so it's more of a spiral than a linear progression. And we therefore will need to assess in the CFR to what extent at different age groups the original illustrative can-do statements are appropriate to that level of cognitive development. Another way of looking at this is that where there's close correspondence between what young learners can do and what adults can do, what changes is the context. So there's a lot of closer correspondence, unsurprisingly, at the lower levels, at the A1 and A2 levels, especially with things like greetings, introductions, talking about yourself, but people do this at all ages. Then looking at these illustrations in the middle, a show and tell exercise for a young learner might be mobilizing competences that are further developed in presentation skills in an adult domain. So by making that relation with the can-do descriptors, we can see how activities in the young learner classroom are preparing them for lifelong learning, in that they will be revisited, and it's not just working your way up from A1, A2, B1 and so on to adulthood. Actually, you need to come back and revisit these competences through the education pathway, so that at B1 what you're able to do might be in a different context, from show and tell in a classroom of young learners to presentation in an adult program. But then there are some higher level tasks that may demand a level of cognitive or social maturity that, I mean, and I emphasize may, that's why I've put that illustration there, but the higher level descriptors often contain situations that simply are too cognitively demanding for young learners, and therefore maybe not so relevant to adapt into activities in the young learner classroom. So this project set out to help people filter this whole bank of descriptors in the CFR accordingly for different age groups. Our outcomes, which were achieved, one was to have this collation of descriptors which can inform further development of language portfolios in the classroom, and through this identify areas that you might tackle for new approaches in the young learner classroom for lifelong learning. So we have the extended set dealing with mediation descriptors, and the mediation does relate very clearly to integrated skills, where you might be relaying or summarizing something that you've read or heard, and in fact that's very relevant to sharing of experience, and that's something that is also very relevant to young learners. So you'll have an inventory of things to look at that you could adapt to the young learner classroom. A bit about the actual research process itself. It wasn't myself who did the actual collation. I project managed this, and Tunde Sabo of the British Council in Budapest was the main collator, rater of these descriptors. We had a supervisory sounding board and consultants, including Angela Hasselgreen and Ellie Moe. Angela Hasselgreen, you may know her from the Bergen Can Do Statement project, which dealt with younger learners. And the sources, we had 35 portfolios collated, and they were from 19 countries. We actually ended up using 19 of them because there was so much repetition, but that was a good representative sample, and that included language portfolios that were in the original Council of Europe bank of descriptors, and then more that were validated through the process of validation that happened up to 2011 from different countries. And Cambridge English also, Cambridge English Assessment also contributed can-do statements from the Starters, Movers, Flyers series. When we looked at the age groups represented in all the material we collected, unsurprisingly, it focused mainly on primary and secondary. And you can see on the left here, those are the actual portfolio titles, the different countries they came from, and the age groups they covered. So taking an average, it looked like we were collating things for the age group 7 to 10 and the age group 11 to 15, which roughly correspond to primary and secondary. And then to offer these in documents to you as practitioners, what we also wanted to do was get away from this thing where you look through the scales of descriptors and you've got A1 up to C2 for a particular area. As someone planning a course, actually your group of learners will all be at a similar level usually. And so it's much more useful to have a document where you can say, well, what are all the descriptors that we have at A1? Or what are all the descriptors that we have at A2? And so that's how the documents were organized for this project, for the two age groups. After we did this global mapping exercise, then we turned it into these two documents, sort of filtered by level. Okay, so this is a bit difficult to read, but it's just to show you when you download the document how it's structured. It's just got three main things really. It's a big table for each level, and you have the level at the top, which includes pre-A1 now. That's now been recognised as a halfway stage to A1. And you'll have the original CEFR descriptor on the left. Then there's a column saying what the raters thought in terms of relevance to the age group. In this case, in the example, it's 7 to 10. And then on the right-hand side, portfolio descriptors taken from real contexts that logically relate to this descriptor in the CEFR. Now, the usefulness of looking at that right-hand column is really to give you a good example of how you go from a CEFR descriptor to something that's more appropriate to the age group. And there are lots of examples that we've collected here. But quite often, you'll have nothing in that right-hand column because it's a new descriptor and there were no language portfolios for that area. And so this is where practitioners are invited to start adapting for the age group and choosing descriptors that might be relevant. And so this middle column becomes very important then in deciding whether something is relevant to adapt. Again, another bit of text that's difficult to read, but I'll explain. This is just a heat map, actually, of what we found in the existing European language portfolios for the two age groups against the scales as they were at the time. There's been some tweaks since then, but not surprisingly, you had sustained monologue describing experience. There are a lot of existing descriptors in this area, in those age groups, because it's storytelling. It's show and tell. It's describe your day, your weekend, these kinds of activities, and also obviously listen to the teacher, listening comprehension, and reading for information and argument, reading a text on a subject. I think these are very strongly represented in existing language portfolios for young learners. But what it also shows is that there are a lot of areas here where we might have relevant things to address with young learners where nothing exists in the portfolios yet, and we can be selective and decide what to develop. So those evaluations of relevance in the middle column I use a standardized wording with occasional bits of advice. So it will either say that the descriptor is relevant, partially relevant, or not relevant. But actually what we did in the end with the documents for the two age groups is just get rid of all the ones that are not relevant because that is not useful. So what you end up with is statements of whether the descriptor is partially relevant or whether you need to think more about adapting that descriptor to context and some guidance for that. Okay, so here's an example at the upper range of competence where you start getting issues of relevance. Can establish a relationship with interlocutors through sympathetic questioning, expressions of agreement, plus, if appropriate, comments about third parties or shared conditions. That's very long-winded for a learning aim, and it wouldn't really be expressed that way in a classroom learning aim. It needs to be simplified, but also it was deemed by the panel not to be relevant to 7 to 10. It was a bit too sophisticated in terms of this sympathetic questioning. But you could work towards it with a group in secondary with age-appropriate tasks. It might be in a debating society or something like this. Whereas indicating reservations, reluctance, conditions when agreeing to requests, this is something more approachable even with the younger group because it's about negotiating, and every young learner will have experience of doing that with their parents in their own first language, so it can be something you can role play. Here's another very dense slide, another heat map. What this shows is these relevance comments. So the last slide I showed like this showed actually that first column, descriptors 7 to 10, where you had a lot in the area of storytelling, spoken production. But when we look at what the panel thought about things that you might look at and adapt, that's what the two columns of red and green, relevant and partially relevant. And you see that obviously there's quite a lot that is relevant in the linguistic competencies, which might actually be dealt with a language resource part of the portfolio with items of grammar and vocabulary. But also in the partially relevant area, there are quite a lot of descriptors highlighted for cognitive mediation and relational mediation. These are mediating a text and mediating communication. So integrated skills actually, mediating a text. Project work where learners will go and find information and bring it together and put it into a poster and present that to their peers, so that what you're setting out as a learning aim takes in all of these stages, rather than separating out listening, reading, speaking and writing as completely separate activities. It's a natural thing of a good communicative classroom that these are integrated, and in fact mediation descriptors highlight that very well. It also shows how there's a big overlap with the other descriptors in the CFR because it's a new way of looking at things. But yeah, that's what I'm illustrating here, and there's a similar situation for the age group 11 to 15, where you also see a lot of relevance coming in, partial relevance for pluricultural and plurilingual competencies. And there are already projects going on to look at these competencies with secondary groups where you can consciously set up an exercise where you encourage people to use whatever linguistic resources they have available to them to achieve a task. That depends on how multinational, multilingual your group is. The project I'm thinking of at the moment is one in Canada where you do have quite multilingual groups. And plurilingual competencies are the ability of the individual to draw on what they know, what they guess about different languages. And And a conscious approach to this is actually an interesting thing to do with learners, as long as it's clear that's what they're doing on a particular day. And also, again, a lot of emphasis on cognitive mediation, relaying texts, and relational mediation, being part of a group, managing the problem solving, perhaps, in teamwork. I think that's what you'll find in relational mediation, which in the CFR is called mediating communication now. So, challenges. I've just described how in this document you'll find lots of pointers to say, well, these new descriptors might be relevant to your age group, but there's nothing existing in terms of age adapted learning aims, so it's up to you to try that. But I think if you're a senior teacher, perhaps trying to introduce this initiative in your own context, you might have to mitigate a perceived overload of new information for teachers on the team, especially if they're looking at the companion volume itself to the CFR, because that's a huge new inventory, and you don't have to use everything in there. Similarly, you don't have to use everything that's contained in these collation documents for young learners. It's expected actually that you will cherry pick and adapt. But also achieving this cultural change, this paradigm shift to thinking more in terms of the global outcomes of classroom activities and communicative activities, and integrated skills in mediation. Because obviously the easiest thing to evidence in the classroom is production of correct forms, focus on form, focus on grammar, vocabulary, phonology. But at the same time, I mean, that's important, but at the same time, it's important to think with the learners about how they've achieved a task. And the can-do statements really help with that, if they can be used to reflect and to set targets for lessons, and to inspire the creation of new activities. But it is important to respond appropriately to the needs of the context, and that's one of the reasons why we don't yet have a CFR for young learners, because the whole project to extend the CFR is already something quite comprehensive and complex to deal with different types of competence for reception, interaction, production, and mediation. But the individual needs of young learners at different ages, but also in different contexts, will vary, and from individual to individual. That's the job of the teacher, to take into account individual differences and not regard can-do statements as a kind of expectation. It's more an aim, a goal, and people can have uneven profiles. So the way to approach self-evaluation in a portfolio is in terms of confidence, and it's not that you've passed or failed a list of can-do statements, that it's something you revisit over time. One thing I've found useful in the classroom when using can-do statements as learning aims, both for the teacher and the learners, is to think of them as something you will try out in different ways again and again over time. So you take away the I can when you write it on the board, instead of, I can join a discussion and give my point of view. The aim of the lesson is join a discussion and give a point of view, and do it again. And maybe at the end you don't feel completely confident, but we'll do it again next week and the week after. And only use the wording I can when you're self-evaluating in the portfolio. And maybe learners can write their own can-do statements as well to extend it, make it more personalized. We did pilots of adapting the new descriptors to different contexts across primary, secondary, higher education, and private language tuition and so on. So there was a nice example I picked out from the pilot feedback. This was during 2016-2017, and it was just a very simple statement, but I felt it encapsulated the advantage of looking at this area and these descriptors. Was that their context was primary? It was A1, A2. It was actually content and language integrated learning. It was a CLIL-based lesson where the learners would take part in European projects for young learners through an e-twinning platform where students could meet other students from other institutions, which made it very exciting and authentic, and collaborate to produce materials about. In this case, it was a project on earthquakes, so a geology project, or geography and geology. But the overall advantage that the teachers fed back from that pilot was just this focus that it gave to the development of competencies for working together online, being part of a group, being conscious of the contributions of others, and helping others to understand, rather than just thinking of yourself as an individual responding to other people, but to really get involved in online teamwork or teamwork face-to-face, where a lot of mediation competencies are actually mobilized. And it was more focused for the teachers, it was more focused for the learners in evaluating how well they did. So if we think about can-do statements in the curriculum as feeding a kind of cycle, we start at the top with learning aims. I say aims rather than outcomes because they might be worded more vaguely without the I can. It's we're going to interact online, etc. Yeah, I mean, online is not a prerequisite here. That's just an example. But that inspires the generation of learning activities. And if your learning aims have a mediation aspect to them, that they have different stages, then that will lend itself very well to project work and staged activities that might have some receptive skills followed by productive skills and people explaining things to each other. Assessment, this is a more difficult question for the new descriptors because we don't want assessment to actually be something that categorize people in a harmful way. I think it's much more promising with descriptors for mediation and plurilingual, pluricultural competences to firstly focus on formative self-assessment. And again, this can be in very simplified can-do statements, illustrated with pictures perhaps, in learner portfolios. But hopefully from that the teacher gets an idea of what to focus on again, what to do more of, because there is that reflective stage they've done with the classroom. They've maybe been able to see the learners' own comments on how they felt about the activities they did, and so that leads into needs analysis for further course design. And course design I use very loosely here. It doesn't have to be a formal curriculum project. It might be just the tweaks you're making week by week to supplement the course book you're working with, to design activities that draw on the learner's own experiences and their own interests. And I think more and more that's the movement we have in language education, is that we have the tools now, if they're managed properly, especially with online, to allow learners to bring in their own interests to the classroom and have that structured with the learning aims that we've given. So the learner's world is at the centre of all of this, and in fact the CFR really promotes and is based upon a learner-centered approach rather than a prescriptive top-down approach, which it sometimes gets mistaken for. You as teachers ultimately have the clear idea of what your learners need and can draw on these descriptors to organize your planning and reflection with the learners, but flexibly. And so, in fact, a good exercise to do together, if you have sessions where you work together with other teachers in the staff room looking at descriptors, is how can you adapt a CFR descriptor and keep it concrete, keep it in terms of a self-standing, positively formulated statement. That's the idea of can-do statements. They are positive whatever level, even at the very lowest level, it's a positive achievement. Okay. So, recommendations for next steps. Obviously, the existing mapping that we've done is with the material that the Council of Europe had, and that relates to 7 to 10 and 11 to 15, and something that I didn't comment on before in a previous slide is that this also corresponds with certain levels of cognitive development in the Piagetian sense, and therefore the question is, to what extent can we do this as well for that earlier stage, pre-7 up to 6? And this is really early childhood education, a growing area, and it would be seen as a next step to try and collate any portfolios that are being created for learners at that stage. But this is no longer portfolios for learner consumption, it's more monitoring of achievement, perhaps with parents and so on. Identify priority areas for the development and calibration of new portfolios. So far, the way portfolios have been developed is that they've been sent in for validation at the Council of Europe, but that service no longer exists. So there may be projects that publishers do, or that exam boards do, to use surveys to calibrate young learner descriptors. Those sorts of projects are going on. And are welcomed by the Council of Europe, and they tend to be specific for specific languages, so there will be projects going on for English. Design informed approaches to lifelong learning towards competences described in the CFR. So this comes back to those heat maps I showed you earlier, where we saw to what extent currently young learner aims cover different parts of the CFR. By having these documents and seeing what's covered, what isn't, I think we can take a more conscious approach to what sort of things to design for the young learner classroom that will equip them for secondary and then for ultimately progressing to higher education, and have that joined up thinking all the way through without being constrained to showing level progression up the scale of the CFR as learners get older. In fact, they can revisit A2 with more sophistication at secondary and then build up to B1, B2. And so there's an assessment washback from that. If you're able, and that can include formative assessment. If you're able to engage with learners with formative assessment, with can-do statements in language portfolios, then that awareness raising, that visibility of what the learning aims are and the can-do statements will wash back on what learners are ready to do next, and what you design as teachers in the classroom. Okay, now a practical note: where to find these documents. They are freely available on the Council of Europe website. The full address for the landing page is here. I think this PowerPoint will be made available. But if you're doing a Google search, I find the most effective one is Council of Europe CFR Bank Supplementary. Those are the keywords because they're in a bank of supplementary descriptors. And so when you go to that page, you scroll down and you'll find links to download the PDFs of the two documents, one for ages 7 to 10 and one for ages 11 to 15. So that's where you'll find them. I invite you to download them. There is an introduction to read, which covers a lot of the issues that I've discussed today in terms of the considerations in putting these documents together and relevance for young learners and so on. So that introduction is, I think it's about 5 or 6 pages. It's not huge. It's something you could read quite accessibly. So yeah, do have a read of that, and then maybe you can explore these documents to think about new areas to bring into your programs and adapt into useful descriptors for your age group that set aims and inspire tasks in the classroom. Okay, so I've come to the end of my slides, but I believe we do have someone who's been monitoring questions that come up in the text and chat through the presentation.
Hi, Tim.
So hi, yeah.
Hi, yeah. Thank you ever so much for that. That was fantastic. A really really interesting and a great opportunity to sort of learn more about the background of this project and the aims of it.
Okay.
So I really hope that everyone else has taken a lot away. There weren't too many questions throughout. I think that everyone was listening intently. So it would be great if there are any questions, please do write them in the chat box now. There was one just now that said, do you think it is difficult to set descriptors for young learners? And I think, you know, you've kind of touched on the difficulties there, but perhaps you could just give us a little insight there.
Yeah, I mean, I think a key issue there is ensuring that they're, as I said, ensuring that they're positively framed, even at a low level, because you might be used to looking at descriptors in assessment schemes where actually it has a deficiency approach. You know, this person is difficult to follow or something like that. You don't want anything like that coming out in a learning aim or a can-do descriptor because it's an achievement. So it needs to be positive. It needs obviously to try and restrict itself to if you're going to present it in the target language, restrict itself to manageable language for that learner at that level and that age group, which obviously you'll have a good idea of as a teacher of that class. But also, I think it's important to think about authenticity. This is a key question for young learners, what an authentic experience is, because the classroom is their world. It's a big part of their daily experience. And so where you might in the CFR have a descriptor that talks about mediating information from a timetable or from a text, a novel or something like this, obviously these might be adult contextual examples. In fact, there is an appendix in the CFR Companion Volume, appendix number 6, which talks about different domains and things that could exemplify the new descriptors in terms of public, personal, educational and professional domains. But a key domain for the young learners is obviously educational in the classroom itself. And so you would reframe that descriptor in terms of maybe a classroom activity, and that's perfectly fine to do that. To rewrite that descriptor so that it highlights something that they might be doing in the classroom. Does that go some way to answering that question?
Yeah, I think the question was quite far back, so hopefully that did go somewhat towards answering it. I think one of the really nice, interesting parts of today was finding out about kind of the areas which are both relevant for adults and for young learners, and it's very
Yeah.
interesting to see how those are. Can be relevant, that some are completely not relevant, but of course you're finding new areas as well, which is really
Yeah.
interesting. There was
Yeah. And so yeah, it's probably the emptiest part of the document, but the most interesting part.
sorry. There was one other question that popped up a moment ago about the possibility of experienced teachers being involved in the research. Is there
Mhm.
is there any possibility of that?
Yes, I mean, I think it's important to go to your institution and see to what extent they're willing to support that themselves, but because it takes time and effort, obviously. But the Council of Europe has invited the contribution of case studies in terms of elaboration of the companion volume uh, into specific contexts. And there was a launch conference at the head offices last week where we had representatives of all the member states, and this was put out as a call for contributions over the next academic year. And if your institution is interested in contributing a case study, there is now a template that's been put together, and we could put you in touch with the Education Department of the Council of Europe to register your interest.
Great, that's really good to know that that there have already been contributions and the opportunity of potentially doing case studies as well to further the research.
Yeah.
Excellent. Any other questions out there that you would like to ask Tim while we still have him here? Lots of thank yous and lots of appreciative messages there for you,
It's great to see. Well, thank you everybody for listening all the way through. That was great.
Brilliant. Okay. So if we'll just wait one more minute, see if anyone else has any other questions.
Yeah, I've added some selected readings on the last slide. Again, assuming that this PowerPoint will be made available to people who attended.
Yes, we will be uploading the recording of the session as well as the PDF of the webinar, of the presentation.
Okay, great.
Excellent. So no other questions? Last chance, folks.
I guess people will also want to check with you about how they get their certificate, won't they?
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. We'll just be adding that to this slide now so people can click to download the file here. And remember, if you're using a mobile device, sometimes it's difficult to download from here, but you can email us and we're just adding the email address to the chat box now. So any useful websites there from Lilia? So is this for, if I just click back one slide, there's lots of selected references and readings there. And Tim, you also mentioned a website earlier on.
Yeah, so if you click back to, I mean, people will just know where to find this in the presentation, but it's in the last couple of slides. That's showing the actual Council of Europe website where the documents are held. But I think also it would be useful if you look at the ECML website for projects ongoing. This is the European Commission for Modern Languages, and also there is a website for the European Language Portfolio, which you can just Google, and you'll find the Council of Europe website for the European Language Portfolio. That has lots of examples of existing portfolios that people have created that you could actually, some of them you can download and edit.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Tim. I think that that's brought us to the end of the session.
Okay.
And we'll just stay online for a few more minutes so that everybody can download their certificate.
Okay.
But other than that, thank you very much, Tim, and thank you everyone for attending. As I say, we'll be online now for a few more minutes so you can download and also check and send your emails if you want to get your certificate.
Right. Well, thank you, everybody. I guess, shall I say goodbye now while people just get their certificates?
That's fine. Thanks, Tim.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, again, and enjoy the rest of the day or evening. And yes, hope to see you online again soon at some point.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tim.